Keir Giles is a senior consulting fellow at the Russia and Eurasia Programme at Chatham House. He's also the author of Moscow Rules: What Drives Russia to Confront the West, and he joins me now live. It's a pleasure to have you on the program, sir. Now, in that book you wrote a couple of years ago, your analysis was quite spot on, looking at everything happening in our current day. Share some of that insight with us and tell us why Russia is doing what it's doing today.
Well, the problem is, although it's come as a huge surprise to the world that Russia has launched this operation, most of what is happening in Russia today, both in its internal domestic politics and its relationships with the outside world, isn't actually new. It's just the culmination of a long process. The basic problem that Russia has with countries like Ukraine, which are independent sovereign nations, is that it still thinks they should be part of the Russian Empire. This was something which was plain to long-term Russia watchers over the years leading up to this invasion, and it was actually stated very clearly by President Putin shortly before he launched the assault, saying that the decisions of 100 years ago, when the Russian Empire came apart after the pressures of the First World War, were catastrophic and should be reversed. Now, the problem is that comes into direct conflict with how the West and how Europe in particular thinks countries ought to organize their affairs. They think that Ukraine and other borderline countries with Russia should be sovereign, independent nations which are not dependent on Moscow. That's where we have this clash between Russia and the West developing. Meanwhile, of course, Russia is also clamping down on its own domestic population, making sure that they are once again under complete control of the state. And the result of that is that a lot of Russians now do not have this clear picture of what is happening in the rest of the world, including in Ukraine.
Right. We're going to get into that a little later in this interview, but Russia's made it clear that any sort of military assistance to Ukraine would be a target. And we saw that happen with the military base that it attacked along the Polish border. And we know that there are foreign fighters in the country as well at the moment. Do you think that this conflict could very well spill over Ukraine's borders?
Well, Russia would very much like other countries to think that it will spill over other countries' borders, because NATO, the European Union, the Europeans as a whole have signaled very clearly that they are desperately frightened of escalation, that this might actually bring in other countries into the Ukrainian conflict. So Russia can play on those fears by talking about attacks on convoys, delivering weapons, delivering aid to the Ukrainian side. That's also the reason for the nuclear threats from President Putin, because he knows that there is always an excited response whenever he mentions nuclear weapons. But of course, at the same time, you see Russia trying to do the same thing, trying to bring in foreign fighters, in Russia's case from Syria, and to get aid, in this case from China. So yes, in both cases, it's trying to bring allies on side to support each side in this conflict.
Okay, so there's a lot of moving parts to this conflict. On one hand, we have the EU and the West condemning the attacks, imposing sanctions, and on the other, we have China not condemning the attacks, but calling for calm. But after Russia stops this incursion, what will they be left with? What is their ultimate aim?
The ultimate aim was always clear, and it is the erasure of Ukraine from the map as an independent country and the elimination of Ukrainians as a nation, as a people, in order that reality matches up with President Putin's ideas of how it should be. Now, they haven't succeeded, and the fact that both the Ukrainian and the Russian sides are now saying that there is scope for negotiation at the peace talks, instead of just Russia delivering ultimatums, is an indication that Russia itself has recognized how badly this war is going for them, because now they need to look for a way out that actually recognizes that Ukraine has a right to exist. That means there are far more options open for how this conflict could end. But I think what we'll see very soon, given the ongoing creation of these humanitarian catastrophes by Russia, is increasing pressure on Ukraine to surrender, simply in order to stop the suffering.
Right, and back to your point that you made on how this is affecting mainstream Russians, it's quite overwhelming as for them, not just financially, but psychologically as well. I mean, dozens of companies have halted operations. The ruble has dramatically fallen. What does this mean for the people of Russia and ultimately for the future of their own country?
Well, that's exactly right. You just heard from your correspondent in Moscow talking about the personal, individual impact on ordinary Russians of what is happening. The problem is they may well not actually link what is happening to them with what Russia is doing overseas, because Russia has worked so very hard at insulating its population from the external reality. So when the Russian state blames all of this economic and psychological suffering that Russians are undergoing on the West, there's an indication that a lot of people will actually believe them, just as a lot of people support this attack on Ukraine for entirely misguided reasons. So it may not necessarily bring about the kind of pressure on the Russian state to change its behavior that Western leaders might expect, even if Russian populations were in fact able to come out and protest. But as we've seen, any protest against the war is dealt with ruthlessly, brutally, and immediately.
So looking at all the events that have taken place since Russia kind of, recognized the independence of the Donetsk and the Luhansk regions up until now, what do you think is going to happen in the aftermath of all of this? What are you worried about the most?
There are a lot of wild cards and a lot of open questions, but one thing that seems absolutely clear is the devastation that is going to be wrought both on Ukraine through direct Russian military action and on the Russian economy. And the longer this goes on, the worse the damage is going to get. The next stages, unfortunately, are very likely to be Russia escalating still further in a bid to end this conflict. And it is surprising that we haven't yet seen the use of chemical weapons to inflict mass casualties in Ukraine. That's expected any day now. Recovering from that devastation on both sides is going to be a long process. But the very first step, of course, has to be the withdrawal of Russian troops. And it is that Western countries that are backing Ukraine ought to be insisting on in supporting the Ukrainian government in resisting the Russian incursion for as long as possible.
All right, Keir Giles, thank you so much for joining us here on the News Hour. It was a pleasure speaking to you.